In the 1890s, Andrew Carnegie sold steel rails at $17 a ton. His competitors needed 24 just to break even. This wasn't because Carnegie had better technology. The Bessemer converter was a commodity, available to anyone with capital. It wasn't government protection either. What Carnegie had was something far more dangerous than a patent or a tariff. He owned the iron ore under the ground in Minnesota, the ships that carried it across the Great Lakes, the railroad that delivered it to Pittsburgh, and the coke ovens that fueled his furnaces. Every dollar that used to leak to a middleman, the mining company, the shipping line, the railroad operator, Carnegie rerouted into his own margin. And then he weaponized that margin to price every competitor out of the American steel market. Around the same time, John D. Rockefeller was running an even more extreme version of the same playbook in oil. By the late 1870s, Standard Oil controlled over 90% of all oil refining capacity in the United States. Rockefeller didn't just beat his competitors, he made competition structurally impossible by locking down the transportation infrastructure that every barrel of oil had to pass through. These two men didn't invent monopoly, but they perfected its industrial age form. And the story of how they did it, of how free competition in heavy industry inevitably collapsed into monopoly, how two different countries engineered two very different solutions to the same structural crisis, and how the logic of cost compression and infrastructure control created moats that couldn't be crossed, is not just a chapter from the 1890s. It's the operating system that still runs underneath Amazon's logistics network, Google's search infrastructure, and every platform economy on Earth today. To understand why monopoly wasn't a bug but a feature of late 19th century industrialization, you need to understand what changed about the nature of industry itself in the second half of the 1800s. Before steel, the backbone of industrial civilization was iron. Iron built the early railroads, the bridges, the factory frames, but iron had a critical weakness. It was brittle. Iron rails cracked under heavy use. Metal fatigue could snap a rail line without warning. Iron bridges developed hairline fractures under repeated vibration and occasionally collapsed. Steel was stronger, more flexible, more durable. A steel rail lasted 5 to 10 times longer than iron, but for centuries steel could only be produced in tiny batches, slowly and expensively. It was a luxury material, not an industrial one. That changed in 1856 when Henry Bessemer presented his converter process to the British Association for the Advancement of Science. The Bessemer converter could turn molten iron into steel in 30 minutes, producing several tons per batch. Overnight, steel went from an artisanal product to a standardized industrial commodity. The implications were staggering. Railroads could now be built to last, bridges could carry heavier loads, and the entire physical infrastructure of industrial civilization could be rebuilt on a stronger foundation. But this technological revolution created a structural problem that nobody anticipated. Because the Bessemer process required enormous capital investment, giant converters, blast furnaces, rolling mills, all of it financed with borrowed money, it transformed steelmaking from a modestly capitalized trade into a heavily leveraged, fixed-cost-intensive industry, and that changed everything about how competition worked. A textile mill can scale down. If demand drops, you idle some looms, send workers home, and wait. The fixed costs are manageable. But a blast furnace is a different animal entirely. It costs a fortune to build, almost all of it borrowed. Whether you run it or not, the interest payments on the construction debt and the depreciation on the equipment don't pause. You open your eyes every morning already owing money. The only way to service that debt is to keep the furnace lit, keep producing, keep selling, even if the price you're getting barely covers your coal and iron ore. This creates a brutal paradox. When demand slows and the market enters a downturn, the rational response for any individual company is not to cut production. It's to increase it, because as long as the selling price covers your variable costs, your raw materials, your labor, every ton you sell generates some cash to throw at the fixed cost hole. Shutting down doesn't save you money. It just means you're paying interest on an idle asset while your competitor takes your customers. So everyone keeps producing. Everyone keeps cutting prices to win the next order. And because everyone is doing this simultaneously, prices spiral below everyone's break-even line. This is a textbook Nash equilibrium trap, a prisoner's dilemma at industry scale. Nobody wants to cut prices, but whoever cuts first survives another month. And if you can outlast the company next door, maybe they go bankrupt and you inherit their customers. The problem is there's no winner. The game just produces an industry-wide collapse in returns on capital. By the 1870s and 1880s, both the United States and Germany had built unified national markets. The U.S. through the Civil War and the Transcontinental Railroad, Germany through the Zollverein Customs Union and political unification. The external threat of British dumping had receded, but the internal threat of overcapacity and ruinous price competition was tearing these industries apart from the inside. Capital had to find a way to stop the bleeding, and in Germany and America, it found two radically different answers. The German answer was the cartel, and to understand how it worked, you need to understand the institution that made it possible, the universal bank. Unlike British banks, which stuck to deposits and lending, German banks like Deutsche Bank operated on a completely different model. They held both debt and equity in the same industrial companies. They lent money to a steel mill, and they sat on its board of directors. They were simultaneously creditor and owner. This created a very specific incentive. When a universal bank examined its portfolio and realized that two steel companies it had financed were locked in a vicious price war, each undercutting the other, each destroying the other's margins, the bank had a direct problem. That price war wasn't just hurting the companies. It was eating the bank's dividend income and threatening the security of its loans. So the bankers intervened. The executives from these universal banks used their board seats and their lending leverage to force their portfolio companies into binding agreements. Minimum prices were fixed, sales territories were carved up, production quotas were assigned to each member, and the enforcement mechanism was simple. Any company that broke ranks, that secretly undercut the agreed price or exceeded its quota, would have its credit line pulled the next morning. In heavy industry, where every company was leveraged to its limit, losing your bank was the same as closing your doors. This is how the German cartel was born. The Rhenish-Westphalian Coal Syndicate, established in 1893 in Essen, brought together nearly 100 mining companies and eventually controlled over 90% of Ruhr coal output. Each member remained legally independent. Economically, they could no longer compete with each other. But the cartel had a fatal design flaw, one that would prove to be its undoing as an organizational model. Because the cartel was a horizontal compromise among equals, it had to keep every member satisfied enough to stay in the alliance. That meant the agreed floor price couldn't be set at the industry's average cost. It had to be anchored to the highest cost, least efficient member of the group. If the weakest player couldn't cover its costs at the cartel price, it would defect, start secretly undercutting to generate survival cash, and the entire structure would collapse. Consider what this meant in practice. Say the most efficient mill in the cartel produced steel for 10 marks per ton. The least efficient, running aging furnaces and outdated equipment, needed 15. The cartel price would be locked at 16, enough to keep the weakest member alive with a thin margin. The efficient producer was pocketing 6 marks per ton in pure profit, but was forbidden by the quota system from expanding production to capture the inefficient mill's market share. Its superior technology was effectively neutralized. The cartel stabilized prices and saved balance sheets across the industry, but it also blocked the market's natural clearing mechanism. Companies that should have gone bankrupt, that were consuming capital and raw materials without producing competitive output, were kept alive by the monopoly premium. The cost of stability was a chronic misallocation of capital across the entire German heavy industrial sector. The cartel preserved the weak at the expense of the strong. On the other side of the Atlantic, Rockefeller looked at this kind of arrangement and saw exactly this weakness. He wasn't interested in compromising with inefficient producers. He wanted absolute control, the power to shut down the weak, consolidate the strong, and dictate terms to every player in the chain. But he faced a legal obstacle. In the 1870s and 1880s, most American states prohibited one corporation from owning stock in another corporation incorporated in a different state. The intent was to prevent cross-state monopolies. In practice, it blocked the kind of centralized holding structure Rockefeller needed. So his lawyers invented a workaround, a legal mechanism so powerful it gave its name to an entire body of law. In 1882, they created the Standard Oil Trust. The mechanics were elegant in their simplicity. Rockefeller established a board of 9 trustees. The owners of dozens of refineries across multiple states were asked, or pressured, to surrender their actual voting shares to these 9 men. In exchange, each owner received a trust certificate, a document entitling them to dividends, but granting zero say in how the business was run. On paper, this was just a group of individuals voluntarily managing each other's property. No corporation was holding stock in another corporation. No state law was technically violated. But in practice, Rockefeller had built a shadow board of directors controlling the strategy, pricing, and operations of the entire American oil refining industry. And unlike the German cartel, the trust's first move was surgery. Rockefeller didn't subsidize the weak. He eliminated them. Inefficient refineries were shut down. Equipment was stripped. Workers were dismissed. The capital and orders that had been spread across dozens of small operators were concentrated into a handful of massive state-of-the-art facilities. This difference between cartel and trust matters far beyond the history books. The cartel was a defensive financial tool. It froze the industry in place, locking in a price floor while preserving all the old, inefficient capacity. The trust was an offensive organizational weapon. It destroyed and rebuilt the asset base, capturing both monopoly pricing power and the operational efficiencies of consolidation. This contrast helps explain why, by the turn of the century, American heavy industry was pulling ahead of Europe in capital efficiency and the sheer speed at which profits could be extracted and reinvested. But the trust was only the organizational architecture. The real weapon, what made Standard Oil not just big but invincible, was Rockefeller's mastery of transportation economics. The story starts in the 1860s, when commercial oil production began in Pennsylvania after Edwin Drake's 1859 well. The critical bottleneck wasn't drilling or refining. It was moving the oil. Railroads were the only viable transport, and in 1865, shipping a barrel of crude from the Pennsylvania oil fields to Cleveland cost 60 cents to $1, sometimes more than the oil itself was worth. Rockefeller saw a structural arbitrage opportunity. Whoever could compress transportation costs would own the industry's profit margin, and he had the leverage to do it. By consolidating multiple small refineries in Cleveland, he had volume, real, guaranteed, daily shipment volume. Railroads need predictable cargo to fill their cars. In 1868, the Lake Shore Railroad, part of Cornelius Vanderbilt's New York Central system, gave Rockefeller a preferential rate of 35 cents per barrel, with additional monthly rebates based on volume. Other refiners were paying 60 cents to $1. Rockefeller's actual cost, after rebates, may have been below 25 cents. Then came the arrangement that turned a cost advantage into a kill mechanism. In 1872, Rockefeller joined the South Improvement Company, a shell corporation registered in Pennsylvania that negotiated secret contracts with 3 major railroads. The terms were extraordinary. Member refiners received 50 cents per barrel rebates on their own shipments, and for every barrel that a non-member competitor shipped on those same railroads, the railroad paid a portion of the competitor's freight charge directly to Standard Oil. Your rival wasn't just paying higher shipping costs, they were effectively subsidizing your operation every time they moved a barrel. When this scheme leaked to the press, it triggered riots in the Pennsylvania oil towns. Mobs stormed Standard Oil offices. The state legislature revoked the South Improvement Company's charter before a single barrel was shipped under the agreement. But the damage was already done. The mere threat of the arrangement, the knowledge that Rockefeller could at any moment make their shipping costs uneconomical, drove Cleveland's independent refiners to the negotiating table. In 6 weeks during February and March of 1872, Rockefeller acquired 22 of 26 competing refineries in Cleveland. He offered them a choice: sell to Standard Oil for cash or stock, or try to survive against a competitor whose transportation costs were half of yours. Most sold. The ones who held out were eventually priced into bankruptcy. By the end of the operation, later dubbed the Cleveland Massacre, Standard Oil controlled 85% of Cleveland's refining capacity, roughly a quarter of the national total. And Cleveland was just the opening move. What followed was a systematic campaign of horizontal integration that has few parallels in business history. Rockefeller moved outward from Cleveland to Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, New York, New Jersey, buying, absorbing, or destroying every independent refiner he encountered. The logic chain was self-reinforcing. More refineries meant more volume. More volume meant more leverage with railroads. More leverage meant lower costs. Lower costs meant lower prices. Lower prices meant competitors couldn't survive, and their exit meant more volume for Standard Oil. The snowball fed itself. The method was consistent. Rockefeller's agents would approach an independent refiner with a straightforward proposition: sell your refinery to Standard Oil for a fair price, in cash or Standard Oil stock, and walk away comfortably. Or refuse and watch as Standard Oil undercuts your kerosene price in every market you serve until your customers leave. Your Cash flow dries up, and your refinery is worth a fraction of what we're offering today. It wasn't subtle. It didn't need to be. After each acquisition, Rockefeller applied the same triage. Refineries with modern equipment, good locations, or useful market access were kept running, rebranded, standardized, folded into the system. Refineries that were outdated, redundant, or poorly positioned were shut down immediately. Equipment was salvaged, workers were released, and the production quota was redistributed to the surviving, more efficient plants. It was the opposite of the German cartel's approach, where the cartel preserved every member to maintain alliance stability. Rockefeller eliminated the weak to maximize system efficiency. By the late 1870s, Standard Oil controlled over 90% of American refining capacity. And here's the paradox that made the company so difficult to attack politically. Kerosene prices dropped dramatically during this period, from about 58 cents per gallon in 1865 to around 26 cents by 1870, and eventually to less than 8 cents by 1900. American families were paying a fraction of what they'd paid a generation earlier for the lamp fuel that lit their homes and workshops. Standard Oil's defenders could, and did, argue that the monopoly was actually good for consumers. Scale economies brought lower costs, and lower costs brought lower prices. What was the problem? The problem, of course, was that 147 independent refining companies had been destroyed or absorbed along the way. The oil producers in Pennsylvania found that their buyer pool had shrunk to essentially one entity, which could dictate the purchase price of crude. Railroad companies discovered that a massive share of their freight revenue was tied to a single customer whose demands they couldn't refuse. The price might be low today, but the power to raise it tomorrow rested entirely in the hands of one man, and no one had voted for him. Then Rockefeller made the move that transformed Standard Oil from a dominant company into an infrastructure monopoly. In 1879, a group of independent producers, desperate to break Standard Oil's railroad stranglehold, did something audacious. They built the Tidewater Pipeline, a 109-mile, 6-inch wrought iron pipe from the oil fields of Bradford, Pennsylvania, over the Allegheny Mountains to Williamsport, connecting to railroads that Standard Oil didn't control. It was the first long-distance crude oil pipeline in history, built in 90 days, and it worked. Rockefeller's response was immediate. He didn't try to block the pipeline. He built his own. Within 3 years, Standard Oil had laid thousands of miles of pipeline connecting the Pennsylvania oil fields to its refining centers in Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and the East Coast. By 1882, Rockefeller controlled 3,000 miles of pipeline infrastructure. And this is where the game changed permanently. A railroad is a competitive transportation mode. Oil can also move by road, canal, or rival rail line. There's always some alternative, some leverage point for the shipper. But a pipeline is a fundamentally different kind of infrastructure. It's dedicated to a single commodity. It's private, no common carrier obligation, no public access requirement, and it's nearly impossible to duplicate. Building a long-distance pipeline requires enormous capital, right-of-way acquisition across hundreds of miles of private land, pumping stations every few dozen miles, storage terminals at both ends. Once one company has built the pipeline along a particular corridor, building a second one next to it almost never makes economic sense. The capital cost is too high, the capacity of the first pipe usually exceeds demand, and the first mover can always cut its tariff to make the second pipe's return on investment negative. This is the logic of natural monopoly, and Rockefeller grasped it instinctively. By 1882, Standard Oil had built a pipeline network so comprehensive that it functioned as the circulatory system of the entire American oil industry. His oil moved through his pipes at a fraction of the cost of rail. Competitors had three choices: use Rockefeller's infrastructure and pay whatever toll he set, try to build their own parallel system at prohibitive cost, or exit the industry entirely. Most chose the first option, which meant Rockefeller collected rent on every barrel his competitors produced. A few chose the third. Rockefeller had become the gatekeeper of American oil, not because he produced the most crude, he didn't even own most of the wells, but because he controlled the two bottlenecks that every barrel had to pass through: refining capacity and transportation infrastructure. The pipeline was the original infrastructure lock-in, a century before anyone used that phrase to describe cloud computing platforms or mobile app stores. Now let's go back to steel, because Carnegie was watching Rockefeller, and he learned. There's a direct line between what Rockefeller did in oil and what Carnegie would do in steel. Both men understood that in a commodity industry, where the end product is functionally identical regardless of who makes it. The only sustainable advantage is cost, not branding, not customer loyalty, not product differentiation. Cost. And cost, in a heavy industry, is determined not by what happens inside the factory, but by what happens around it. The supply chain, the logistics, the raw material sourcing, the labor structure. Carnegie entered the Pittsburgh steel market in the 1870s with no particular advantage. He wasn't early. By the 1860s, American steel mills were sprouting like weeds, many of them backed by European capital with deeper pockets and more mature technical expertise. The Bessemer process was available to anyone who could afford the license. Carnegie could afford it. So could a dozen others. If the game was purely about who had the best furnace, Carnegie would have been one player among many. But Carnegie asked a different question. While his competitors obsessed over furnace technology and metallurgical technique, Carnegie looked at the entire chain from raw ore to finished rail and asked, at each step, who is extracting margin and can I eliminate them? The answer was, everywhere. Iron ore was purchased from mining companies. It was shipped across the Great Lakes by independent carriers. It was hauled from lakeside ports to Pittsburgh by railroad companies. Coking coal was bought from fuel suppliers. At every handoff, someone took a cut, and at every handoff, a competitor could potentially insert themselves, or a supplier could raise prices. Carnegie plugged every leak. In the early 1890s, during the Depression following the Panic of 1893, he took controlling stakes in the Mesabi Range iron mines in northern Minnesota, one of the richest deposits on Earth. 60% iron content, practically lying on the surface, extractable for under $3 a ton. Competing mines around Pittsburgh were buried deep underground, 30% iron, $8 to $10 to extract. The cost gap was staggering. But the Mesabi was 1,500 kilometers from Pittsburgh, across 3 Great Lakes. Carnegie built a custom fleet of ore carriers, larger and faster than the market standard. He bought and rebuilt the Bessemer and Lake Erie Railroad, equipping it with custom hopper cars 40% larger than standard gauge, designed to dump their loads from the bottom rather than requiring manual unloading. He constructed dedicated docks and mechanized storage silos on the shore of Lake Erie, engineered for near-zero transfer time. The industry average cost to move a ton of iron ore from mine to mill was $8. Carnegie drove it to $2.50, less than a third. In a business where profit margins were measured in single-digit percentages, that gap was the entire competitive landscape. A competitor buying ore from independent mines at market rates and shipping it via commercial carriers was starting every ton of steel with a $5.50 handicap before the furnace was even lit. Multiply that across hundreds of thousands of tons per year, and the financial difference was not a rounding error. It was an existential threat. And Carnegie's competitors knew it. But knowing it and doing something about it were two entirely different problems. You couldn't replicate Carnegie's supply chain overnight. The Mesabi leases were already locked up. Building a dedicated ship fleet required years and enormous capital. Buying a railroad was the kind of investment that only made sense if you already had the volume to fill it, and you couldn't get that volume without the cost advantage that the railroad was supposed to provide. Carnegie had built a flywheel that could only be assembled in sequence over decades. There was no shortcut. He controlled the labor equation with equal ruthlessness. His workforce was largely immigrants, Irish, German, Eastern European, with no local roots, limited English, and no bargaining power. Carnegie reinforced their dependency through the company town model. Workers lived in company-owned housing, shopped at company-owned stores, and watched their wages cycle back into Carnegie's pocket. When they organized, when the Homestead Strike of 1892 erupted over wage cuts imposed during an economic downturn, Carnegie was conveniently vacationing in Scotland. His partner Henry Clay Frick handled the response. 300 Pinkerton agents were brought in by barge on the Monongahela River. A gun battle broke out on the riverbank. 7 workers and 3 Pinkertons died. The state militia was called in. The strike was broken after 5 months. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, one of the strongest craft unions in America, was effectively destroyed at Homestead and would not recover for decades. Labor costs stayed firmly under Carnegie's control. The Homestead Works itself, built on the Monongahela River south of Pittsburgh, was the largest steel complex in the world, running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, employing over 3,000 workers. with its own power station, machine shops, and fire brigade. Visitors described it as a small city devoted to a single purpose. The heat from the furnaces could be felt hundreds of yards away. The rolling mills ran so continuously that if an ingot cooled enough for a man to sit on, the joke went, you'd have to send to England for it. Its rolling capacity was 3 to 4 times that of the largest British mill. Every element of Carnegie's system fed the same flywheel, and this is worth spelling out, because the flywheel is the single most important structural concept in the economics of heavy industry. Lower costs allowed Carnegie to set lower prices. Lower prices won more orders from the railroads, which were the primary buyers of steel rails. More orders meant the furnaces ran closer to full capacity, and in a fixed-cost business, higher capacity utilization is everything. The enormous depreciation charge on a blast furnace is the same whether it produces 100,000 tons or 300,000 tons. Spread that charge across 3 times the output, and the cost per ton drops dramatically, which pushed Carnegie's per unit costs down further, which let him cut prices again, which won more orders, and around it went. This flywheel had one more property that made it nearly impossible to challenge. It was path-dependent. Each turn of the wheel required assets and relationships that had been accumulated over years: mining leases, custom-built ships, a dedicated railroad, labor contracts, furnace expertise. Even if a competitor had Carnegie's capital, they couldn't replicate 30 years of sequential investment in a single move. The flywheel could only be built in sequence, over time, by someone who had been there from the start. By the late 1890s, Carnegie was selling rails at around $17 a ton. His competitor's break-even line was around $24. Some held on for a few years, bleeding cash, hoping for a market upturn or a miracle. Neither came. One by one, they were either absorbed at distressed valuations or simply went under. Industry concentration in American steel ratcheted up with each price cycle, each recession, each round of bankruptcies. By 1900, Carnegie Steel was producing over 3 million tons annually, roughly a quarter of all American output, with net profits of $40 million in a single year. He was no longer a participant in the market. He was the market itself, and then Carnegie did something that none of his competitors could have predicted. He stopped. By 1900, Carnegie was 65 years old. He had spent 3 decades building the most efficient industrial machine in the world, and it had made him fabulously rich. But he was also exhausted. The price wars were endless. Every competitor he crushed was eventually replaced by a new one with fresh capital and newer technology. The Homestead strike had stained his public reputation. The man who wanted to be remembered as a philanthropist was instead being called a union buster in the press. And there was a deeper structural reality. Carnegie's empire, for all its operational brilliance, was trapped in its own physicality. You couldn't liquidate a blast furnace the way you could sell a stock certificate. The fortune was real, but it was frozen, locked inside iron and steel and railroad track. It was at this point that the dinner that changed American capitalism took place. On December 12, 1900, at the University Club in New York, 80 of Wall Street's most powerful men sat in a banquet hall, while a 38-year-old steelmaker named Charles Schwab, Carnegie's protégé, who had started as a laborer at the Edgar Thomson Works at 17 and risen to president of Carnegie Steel by 35, gave the speech of his life. Schwab laid out a vision. What if Carnegie Steel, Federal Steel, and every other major producer in the country were merged into a single entity? Unified procurement, unified logistics, unified pricing, no more price wars, stable, predictable, enormous profits flowing to investors forever. J.P. Morgan was in the audience. He didn't applaud. After the dinner, he approached Schwab quietly and said, "If Mr. Carnegie is interested, we should talk." What followed was one of the shortest and most consequential negotiations in business history. Schwab visited Carnegie at the St. Andrews Golf Course in Westchester County. Carnegie wrote a number on a slip of paper, $480 million. Schwab carried the paper to Morgan's office at 23 Wall Street. Morgan glanced at it, paused for perhaps 15 minutes, and said, "I accept." No accountants were consulted, no lawyers negotiated terms, no due diligence was performed. The entire transaction, the largest in the history of the world at that point, was agreed on the basis of one number written on one piece of paper, accepted by one man in one meeting. But Carnegie was no fool, and the terms he demanded revealed a mind that understood financial architecture as well as any banker. He didn't take stock in the new company. He insisted on first mortgage gold bonds, senior secured debt with a 5% annual coupon. This was a critical distinction. As a bondholder, Carnegie sat at the top of the capital structure. If Morgan's new company thrived, Carnegie collected his 5% year after year in gold-denominated payments that couldn't be diluted. And if the company failed, if the whole consolidation collapsed, Carnegie, as the first lien creditor, could legally foreclose and reclaim the entire steel empire for nothing. He hadn't sold his company. He had, in effect, rented it to Morgan and positioned himself to get it back for free if the experiment went wrong. Morgan accepted even these terms. He folded Carnegie Steel into United States Steel Corporation, capitalized at $1.4 billion, the first company in human history to cross the billion-dollar mark. On the day it was formed, April 1, 1901, U.S. Steel controlled roughly two-thirds of all American steelmaking capacity. To grasp the scale of Carnegie's payout, the entire U.S. GDP in 1901 was roughly $20 billion. Carnegie's $480 million represented about 2.4% of the country's total economic output. Scale that to today's $30 trillion economy, and you're looking at a sum north of $700 billion. For one man's company negotiated on a golf course. Carnegie retired to philanthropy, eventually giving away over $350 million to build libraries, universities, and concert halls across the English-speaking world. The direction of the American steel industry passed from the hands of a man who knew the cost of every ton of iron ore to a man who had never set foot in a blast furnace but understood something. Carnegie never fully grasped that in the end, the man who controls the capital structure controls the industry, and the man who builds the product, no matter how brilliantly, is eventually replaceable. If you zoom out from these individual stories, the underlying logic forms a clear sequence that has repeated in every major industry since. First, a new technology or a new market creates a boom. Capital floods in. Companies proliferate. Competition is fierce and margins are thin. This is the phase that economists celebrate. Innovation, disruption, creative destruction. Then overcapacity sets in. The boom has attracted too much investment. Supply exceeds demand. Prices collapse. In light industries, the weakest firms simply fail and the market clears naturally. But in heavy industry, in railroads, steel, oil, chemicals, semiconductors, cloud infrastructure, the fixed costs are so enormous that firms can't exit. They're trapped. They keep producing at a loss because the alternative is worse. The prisoner's dilemma kicks in and the whole industry bleeds. At this point, someone steps in to impose order. In 1890s Germany, it was the universal banks, creating cartels to freeze competition in place. In 1880s America, it was Rockefeller, building trusts to consolidate and restructure. In 1900s America, it was Morgan, engineering financial mergers to capture control premiums. The vehicle changes. Cartel agreements, trust certificates, holding companies, leveraged buyouts, but the function is always the same. Eliminate competition, stabilize pricing, and extract the surplus that competitive markets would have distributed to consumers. This is not ancient history. It is a structural template, and once you see it, you start seeing it everywhere. Today, the same cycle runs in plain sight. Amazon didn't win e-commerce by having the best products. It won by owning the logistics network, warehouses, delivery fleet, last-mile infrastructure, and using that cost advantage to price competitors into the ground. Exactly the way Carnegie used his ore ships and private railroad. For years, Amazon ran its retail operations at thin margins or outright losses, funded by AWS profits, until competitors either exited or accepted Amazon's marketplace as their only viable channel. The parallels with Carnegie's price wars aren't metaphorical, they're structural. The weapon is the same. Cross-subsidize a loss-leading product line with profits from a captive infrastructure business, and wait for the competition to bleed out. AWS itself is perhaps the purest modern echo of Rockefeller's pipeline strategy. It didn't dominate cloud computing through superior technology alone. It dominated by building the infrastructure at enormous scale before anyone else, creating switching costs so high that migrating away from AWS, re-architecting applications, retraining teams, renegotiating contracts was more expensive than staying. Once you're inside the pipe owns you. Rockefeller understood this in 1882 with 3,000 miles of wrought iron tube. Amazon understood it in 2006 with server farms. And when you look at the great tech acquisitions of the last 2 decades, Facebook absorbing Instagram and WhatsApp, Google swallowing YouTube, Microsoft taking LinkedIn and Activision, you're watching Morgan's playbook in modern dress. Identify an overcompetitive or adjacent market. Acquire the key asset before it becomes a threat, eliminate the possibility of a price war, and harvest the combined margin. The language is different, strategic acquisition instead of trust, but the economic function is identical. Even the cartel model survives, in modified form. OPEC's production quotas and price coordination are a direct descendant of the Rhenish-Westphalian coal syndicate structure, right down to the same fatal flaw, where the weakest members cheat on their quotas when cash flow gets tight, and the alliance frays until a dominant player, Saudi Arabia, playing the role of the universal bank, reasserts discipline by flooding the market. The vehicles evolve, from trust certificates to holding companies to leveraged buyouts to stock swap acquisitions to platform ecosystems. The underlying physics haven't moved an inch. Overcapacity creates a prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma creates a demand for coordination, and coordination, sooner or later, hardens into control. In the next episode, we'll follow this story into its next phase, where a journalist named Ida Tarbell used her father's ruin as fuel for the most consequential investigation in American business history, where a president named Theodore Roosevelt gave the antitrust law its first real teeth, and where a banker named J.P. Morgan proved that even when you shatter a monopoly, the man who controls the capital structure always finds a way to rebuild it at a higher level. Because the question was never whether monopoly could be broken. The question was whether the power behind it could ever truly be displaced, or whether it simply changes form, finds a new host, and starts the cycle again.